Well, hello everyone, and welcome to March's First Monday Book Club, where we're going to be discussing Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And our facilitator and discussion leader today is going to be Susan Caven. And Susan is going to spend, excuse me, Susan, I'm letting in a few more people.
Oh, sure.
Is going to be spending about 15 to 20 minutes with an overview of the book and of Harriet Beecher Stowe and the important questions that she has sent us to think about. And then we will then turn it over. Susan will then turn it over and let everyone comment and share reactions and thoughts on the book. So with that, let me turn it over to Susan Caven to get us started.
Hey, you all, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be doing this. I've just obviously fallen in love with Harriet Beecher Stowe. I was giving a review on Palmetto Leaves, and we're going to talk about this book late in the end of the thing when she came to Jacksonville and her impact on Jacksonville. And I realized I'd never read Uncle Tom's Cabin. Oh my gosh, here I'm supposedly Jacksonville history, president of the society, and I'd never read her book. And I read it, and I was just knocked to the floor when I read it. And I realized, good grief, how could I have not read this important book? But during that time, and like in 2019, the BBC conducted a global poll to identify the most influential fictional stories that have transcended generations and cultures to shape society. Now, if you had to guess which they were, you would probably guess The Odyssey, number one. Well, you would be exactly right. That's exactly right. Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, was voted number 2 as the most influential story in our civilization. Wow. So we're a book club. We're a book club under a religious emphasis. And so I'd like to think about, why is it that at the first part of Women's History Month, why is Harriet Beecher Stowe the most unlikely person that you can imagine be the one we're talking about 200 years later? And I'm going to try to show that it's because as a woman, she had feelings and had sensitivities as a special woman that most people don't have, but that it's a tale that had been talked about a lot. I mean, the situation, slavery, and the horrors of it, it was written about just all over the time during when she lived. Why are we talking about her book? And I'm going to say that it's because she bypassed the brain. She went straight to the heart. She grabbed hold of that heart, your heart, and she just never let go. And so we're going to talk about why that was happened. So she was a writer like. I think of Irma Brumback, not as funny as Irma Brumback, but she was that kind of writer. She'd written 30 books, countless short stories, all charming, just fun. I mean, you could go back and read them today and you will just be charmed by them. But here we are talking about her. So she was the 6th of 11 of Lyman Beecher. All 7 of these sons became ministers, whether they liked it or not. Sometimes not so much. Lyman was a hellfire and damnation preacher. You sinners, you're going to burn forever. But he also was a loving father, and he really thought education was important. And he could play a fiddle and they could dance, but he was very generous with the switch. And it impacted his family. But he really was impactful in on his family. And his son, Henry Ward Beecher, became a minister. Made Billy Graham look like a piker. He was the most important man in the 1800s, in 1800s America. And he changed the influence of religion from hellfire and damnation to God is love. And he really is considered the father of modern American Christianity. People flocked to him. And Sinclair Lewis said of him, Beecher was a combination of St. Augustine, Barnum Bailey, John Barrymore. He was the greatest teacher since St. Paul. And we're here talking about his sister. So her older sister, Harriet's older sister, was Catherine Beecher, and she started women's schools. She was a dynamic woman. She was a big educator of women. She started schools all over. She was very famous. Her younger sister, Isabella Beecher, was a leading suffragette, well known. Neither of those sisters married. They were outstanding in their day, and we're here talking about Harriet. And so why is that? Um, so this is Harriet at the time, before she was married. Here she is. And she went in her late teens and early 30s, taught at Catherine School. This family had moved to Cincinnati. So Cincinnati's Ohio River is right there. Kentucky is right across the way. And so she was teaching. I had not married. It was getting kind of late for a girl to be married. And one of her students lived in Kentucky. So she went with her student across the river to visit the family. And actually, it's the Marshall Key house. The student was named Key. And he took her to a slave auction. And it just shocked her. And at that slave auction, mothers and children were being separated. And she went home horrified at what she'd seen. Then she met Calvin Stowe, who was an older man, a little bit older than she was. He was a professor. He could speak 7 languages. Kind of a rustic storyteller. He could kind of tell a tale. He was a professor. He was a minister, as back then many times they were. And this is what she wrote about him. I was married when I was 25 years old to a man rich in Greek, Hebrew, and Latin, and Arabic, and alas, rich in nothing else. So from the time she married him to the time she died, she worked to put food on the table. And so what did a woman do at that time? Well, she wrote. And she wrote there back then, not for big newspapers, the New York Times were not interested in what she had to say. But there were things like in our day, a Ladies' Home Journal, or Atlantic Monthly was started during that time. So there were many periodicals. And she wrote just in an engaging, personal way. She had a great deal of charm, and she was able to hone that talent of hers through writing constantly. And she said one day, if you see my name in print, it is because I have to earn a living. And so he never was able to support this family, but he encouraged her writing in a kind way. I think he truly loved her and felt that her writing was very important. So not only did it help support the family, but the writing was important. And I've read so much of her old stuff. It's just dear. I mean, she just, you just like her when you read it. And she tells you about how to run a house and, how to do this and that, how to sew, how to do housekeeping things. And she had stories. She'd tell stories, like her story was, tell me a story, Papa, and then she would go into a story. And so Calvin said to her, I found in a letter, my dear, you must be a literary woman. It is so written in the book of fate. Make all your calculations accordingly. So in Cincinnati, she had started having children. At the end of her day, she had 6 children. You had to have people work in the house, and she had many African Americans working for her. And back then, the Dred Scott Slave Reclamation Act was passed. She was horrified. And one person working for her, she realized, was a runaway slave. And oh my God, because that person could be grabbed away. So she knew the Underground Railroad, and she sent this woman through the Underground Railroad up to Canada. So she's very aware of that. Cincinnati, they're finding now traces of tunnels under the city where the Underground Railroad was done. So, but she was a woman. Life was a housekeeper, and she wrote to her husband this letter. I just says it all. It is a dark, sloppy, rainy, muddy, disagreeable day, and I have been working all day in the kitchen, washing dishes, looking into closets, and seeing a great deal of the dark side of domestic life. I'm sick of the smell of sour milk and sour meat, and sour everything. And then the clothes will not dry and no wet thing does. And everything smells moldy. And altogether, I feel as if I never want to eat again. Then your letter arrived, which was neither sour nor moldy, and formed a very agreeable contrast to all these things, and more so for being unexpected. I am much obliged for it. Then she'd had this, I think it was her third child, young Charlie, in 1849, caught the cholera, just went through Cincinnati, killed almost 3,000 people in that area. And at 18 months, his precious boy died of cholera. And she wrote this about it. At last it's over. Our dear little one is gone from us. He is now among the blessed. My Charlie, my beautiful, loving, gladsome baby, so loving, so sweet, so full of life and hope and strength, now lies shrouded, pale, and cold in the room below. Never was he anything to me but a comfort. He has been my pride and my joy. Many heartaches he has cured for me. Many anxious nights I've held him to my bosom and felt the sorrow and loneliness pass out of me with the touch of his little warm hands. And yet I have just seen him in death agony, looked on his imploring face when I could not help but nor soothe, nor do one thing, not one, to mitigate his cruel suffering, do nothing but pray in my anguish that he may die soon. In 1850, Calvin moves the family to Maine. And that's a year that the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. And there was, people were outraged and horrified. And the year was 1850. She was 39 years old. She'd been married 14 years. She was pregnant with her seventh and last child, was running a homeschool in her house, took in boarders to make money. And she was concerned about the common person. And she said, in church, she saw a vision of a slave being brutally beaten to death. Not suitable for a short subject, but she felt like she just had to write down. The vision was so enormous for her. And so when she wrote about it, and when Calvin read it, he said, Hattie, you must go with it. The Lord intends it so. So at that time, the National Era, which was kind of a moderate abolition paper, started a weekly thing. And so she wrote that and sent it to the National Era. And she started it as Uncle Tom's Cabin, Life Among the Lowly. And it was going to be 5 installments she's going to write. And it's weekly. So she's writing weekly. And she's feeling it. She's in the kitchen table and children are everywhere and boarders and food. And she's at the kitchen table writing and everyone's having her read it out loud. It is bedlam. And she's writing this book. And she said it just flowed from her. So something that was supposed to be 5 installments became 40 installments. She just kept writing and just kept writing and just couldn't stop. She had to write so fast because it was weekly. There were almost no revisions on it. This was just coming out of her. And every weekly paper was sold out before the day was over. It was finally, they published Uncle Tom's Cabin in 2 volumes. On the first day, 3,000 books were sold. The very first day it was available. And 3,000 books were sold on the first day. And it became the first bestseller of any book in American history. People could not get enough of this book. And it was read in the South. I mean, people read it and they felt it. And suddenly, and it was, of course, there were women reading it. And suddenly when the men realized what this book was saying, they stopped it as quickly as they could. But never has a book been written with the success of Uncle Tom, the immediate success like Uncle Tom's Cabin. Soon there were 10,000 more copies sold. The book was in its 2nd edition with 8 presses running day and night, barely able to keep up with the people buying the book. There were 300,000 copies sold in the United States alone, and then over the world, hundreds of thousands of books were sold. no copyright, international copyright. She didn't make a cent out of any of them. But the book was pirated, and 1.5 million copies of the book were sold just in Great Britain. It was translated in over 60 languages. But she said, I didn't write this. God wrote it. I merely did his dictation, a vision blown into my mind as by the rushing mighty wind. I wrote what I did because as a woman, as a mother, I was oppressed and brokenhearted with the sorrows and injustice I saw. Because as a Christian, I felt this dishonor to Christianity. Because as a lover of my country, I trembled with the coming day of wrath. So it wasn't popular because she was famous, or because she had political office, or because she was a man, or because she was wealthy. It was famous because her heartfelt words, shaped and energized by her own personal experiences and what she had seen, and her sense of outrage, the treatment of slaves that she had witnessed, as well as her heartbreak over losing a child and knowing how that truly, truly feels. And she resolved that his death would not be in vain, and some good just has to come from the grief that so many people were feeling. And so what she did was expose the myth that benevolent masters treated their slaves humanely. She said that slavery corrupts all who come in contact with the system, that the people of the North and the South who trade with slave owners, people who buy products depending on slave labor, even the kindly slave owners, when desperate for cash, as in her book, they separated and sold slaves down the river. And so this law of moral justice that she felt was supported by God, that it was a sacred idea rather than a legal one. It was a higher standard of right and wrong. And this is why this touched people. It didn't argue legal, it didn't argue economic, it argued right and wrong. The center that of life and virtue that her, and interesting, she's considered quite a feminist too, because her women, if you noticed in the book, characters were strong, they were very brave, they spoke up, they were upright and moral. The whole idea of feminism and suffragette women voting was moving, but her women were, quote, womanly. They were gentle, and they were non-threatening. I wrote what I did because as a woman, as a mother, I was oppressed and brokenhearted with the sorrows and injustice I saw. Because as a Christian, I felt the dishonor to Christianity. Because as a lover of my country, I trembled. Leo Tolstoy, I mean, she got to Russia. He included on Uncle Tom's short list as the example of the highest art flowing from the love of God and more. In 1995, Uncle Tom's Cabin was still being translated into 68 languages. It's read all over the world, and it's being read today maybe in a different way. It's talking about living a life that you say when you go to church, it's what you really are living, and the fact that people have the right to speak out. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. So in this book, she showed that everyone has the same feelings, whether you're a slave or whether you're a regular person or whether you're a plantation owner, that everyone is human and everyone has the same feelings. And the reason she did this, the way she wrote it as every person in that book has qualities. They have who they are. Simon Legree is the great villain, of course. He was from Vermont in the book. I mean, so he was a northern plantation owner. But everyone had dignity, and even he, at the end, as villainous as he was not excused. He was held responsible for what he did. And this is what was said. Uncle Tom's Cabin, Uncle Tom's Cabin captured the hearts of America. It was the best-selling novel of the 19th century into the 20th century. And she said, it's a matter of taking sides of the weak against the strong, something the best people have all done. And this is a theme that has run through history from the beginning of time. The weak have the rights and the strong have the power, and they should be done together. I feel now that the time has come when even a woman or a child who can speak a word for freedom and humanity is bound to speak. But as she became popular, she took a trip to Europe in 1853, and she met all these famous people. Lady Byron even had a meeting with Queen Victoria, and suddenly she was really gaining confidence and bloom. People said she bloomed, shed her years like magic, and yet she always was pious and charming and connected with people. But she went with her husband and with this group. Well, a woman, of course, isn't supposed to speak. Obviously, women can't speak out loud, and certainly not before a crowd. I mean, everybody knows that. So they went. She's sitting in a chair in the back. Her husband, Calvin Stowe, is standing and giving the talk, because obviously, even though she wrote this famous book, she wasn't capable of doing that. It was unbecoming of a woman to speak publicly, and everyone knew that. Even at events really for her honor, he spoke. But she said, all places where women are excluded tend downward to barbarism. But the moment she is introduced, they will come in with her courtesy and cleanliness, sobriety, order. A man can walk up to the ballot box with his wife or sister on his arm. The voting places, when that happens, the voting places will be far more agreeable than now. So, but unfortunately, she did get the one thing she said she wanted in her writing. She wanted a black silk dress. And this month, the money she made did buy her that. But as her son Charles said, the Stowes had no sense of money management. She was a dreamer of dreams. Her ideas of finance might work among angels, but they were not adopted in New England. She believed everyone and trusted everyone and was cheated and imposed upon without let or hindrance. So she had to keep writing to support the family, and we'll talk about that later. But it's time to let you all in on the conversation. And who would like to? So I gave you some quotes. You don't have to use them, but to me, those quotes kind of solidified what made you understand how she was so popular. And I think the first quote of Liza going across the Ohio River on, this was really an occurrence. In fact, people after the book said, you just made all that stuff up. She said, no, I didn't. And she wrote another book and documented every single thing that she used in Uncle Tom's Cabin. And there was in the newspaper a writing of this woman who holding her baby, running across the Ohio River for freedom. So who would like to speak next? Carol, how about you? You're gonna have to unmute yourself, girl.
Yeah, I muted everybody. So just
yeah, I don't think I want to start. I'd really like to hear what you have to say. I enjoyed the book, and I'm sure I read it when I was in school, but it'd been a very long time. And so I really don't want to comment right now. I'd rather listen. Thank you.
Okay. Who would like to? Lisa. You have to unmute yourself.
Okay.
you're muted. Yeah.
Okay. I had never read the book, and I really wanted to read it. I'd even bought it a few years ago. I was in Hartford, Connecticut, touring her home there, and I bought it. So I was really glad that I read it. I was totally not expecting the religious aspect, how religious the people were. Uncle Tom himself, and other slaves, and then the slave owners. I don't know. What do you think? Did that strike you, Susan?
Well, how about today? I mean,
I
it's been
mean, they
that way.
use, well, the slave
And man, what
owners
does
using
Tom Dillon say,
religion.
man? What he wants to hear, what he wants to hear, and disregards the rest.
Well, and the one quote that you sent out, talked about that, about how they thought that God was backing them up in the order, some people are higher and some people are lower. And I just wasn't expecting that at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who else would like to say something? Yes, Barbara. Unmute yourself.
I was deeply impressed with the beauty of Harriet Beecher Stowe's word choice, her syntax, her language. We don't talk like that anymore, which is a pity. It is so rich and filled with meaning and imagery. And the Christian faith, the faith in Jesus that some of the characters spoke of, this is not Christian light. This is the real deal, boys and girls. This is deep and beautiful. I was also noticed how beautifully she described the physical appearance of people with such sensitivity. And there's kind of a thing of, well, we're not going to nowadays, you shouldn't be looking at someone's appearance and making judgments. But yet in her writing, she saw tenderness and love and conviction and goodness that shone through their eyes, their expression, their appearance. And I think in today's world, we've lost a lot of sensitivity to one another. And, why? Television, the internet, I don't know. I think when there was less distraction, we paid better attention to one another. And the last thing I want to say is, well, two more things. I remembered my daughter had to read this when she was in high school. I spoke to her the other day. She said, "Didn't you have to read it?" I said, "No, I went to high school in Tampa, Florida, and my school only became desegregated in my senior year. No, we did not read that, and it was not on any reading list. When I lived in Tampa when we first moved there, when I was a little girl, it was still Deep South in every way you can think of. So I had a good idea of I had some understanding of what slavery was, but the way she described the heel they were under and the level of degradation, and for some, the horrible working conditions. Although, the house slaves, well, they had it pretty easy. Well, they were still owned like a goat or a mule. So it really brought it more clearly to I found myself crying a couple of times.
Oh yeah, I went through a box of tissues.
But anyway, it's still pertinent today.
Okay, so in her book, she says, perhaps Miss Ophelia said, it's impossible for a person who does no good not to do harm. What do you think that means? Who would like to comment on that? Susan?
That sounds like what happened in the German situation, where those who kept silent spoke by their silence.
Are we doing that today? Tom, what did you think about? I don't know whether you had a chance to read the book, but what did you think?
I really appreciated your having us read it, recommending it, and I also appreciate your introduction today. Thank you, Susan. And these quotes you gave us brought out the fact that you know, it's the moderate, humane men and women, back Harriet Beecher Stowe says, who are responsible for what happened, what was happening. And you know, I'm thinking of 100 years after that, Dr. King from the Birmingham jail, his letter from the Birmingham jail wrote that I must make two honest confessions. I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in this stride toward freedom is not the white citizens counselor of the Ku Klux Klan, but the white moderate. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. So that was 100 years roughly after she wrote the novel. And now here we are 60, 70 years after that letter from the Birmingham jail. And the same truth is right in front of us.
Well, and I think, yes, Paul, you have to mute yourself.
I was so anxious to jump onto something that Tom just said that I started talking. But well, first of all, thank you, Susan, for that fantastic introduction that you presented us with, and it was very helpful. A couple of years ago, I'm trying to think of exactly what the occasion was that it was related to. I think it was, I was taking a course online that was offered by Union Theological Seminary. And I think that that was the setting in which somebody else that was in one of my breakout groups, her last name was Beecher. And it turned out that she was a descendant of Harriet Beecher Stowe, or at least the Beecher family.
Well, yeah, they had a big family.
Exactly, yeah. And currently she lives in the Midwest. But that prompted me to actually buy this book at that time, but I had never read it until now. So, you know, and I'm glad that I did. I remember when I was growing up that among those my family and those who I knew, that the book had an extremely negative connotation. And I think that, I mean, we're talking now about, you know, the mid 60s and so forth, going into the early 70s. And I think that by that time, I don't think it was necessarily a reaction to the book itself in its historical context, but it was the way that certain stereotypes continued after that. That people were well, African Americans were taken. They attributed that back to the book, and that the book was looked at as very negative. But, you know, I think that it'd be very interesting these days, and I don't know exactly how that it might be done, if, say, a movie were to come out now that was based somehow on the book, you know, exactly how that would be interpreted and taken. Because there are certainly some good themes throughout the book. One of the things that I thought was very interesting, and I'm going to get back to the religious themes, but there was the one part where there was this senator, and he was part of passing of this law that required that the slave be returned, and so forth. But yet, whenever he and his household was faced with the situation, he broke that law or allowed it to be broken. So, you know, to me, that does raise a very interesting current issue as to when do issues of morality overcome what the letter of the law might be in any given situation. And so, you know, which going back to what Tom was saying, you know, that certainly it was the case with Martin Luther King when he was arrested, going on these protests and so forth. Certainly what he was doing on his face was violating laws. But nonetheless, he thought there was a greater moral good that not only he saw, but he thought that others should see as well.
And he was
And
willing to take the punishment for breaking the law, though. He didn't try to get,
Exactly.
He went to jail without objection.
Exactly. And I was really surprised and pleased by the heavy religious themes that we saw throughout the book, where it came out through dialogue, for instance, with the as an example, I think it was the wife in New Orleans, his name was Marie or something like that, and the dialogue back and forth as to whether slavery was acceptable and that type of thing. And so those were very interesting and well done techniques on the part of Harriet Beecher Stowe, I thought.
I think that was the power of her writing, was that she showed every point of view. She never was pointing her finger. She was just showing in a natural way how things were. And I think that's why this has gotten under the tit, as they say, because it hits you in your heart first. And I think also, Women's History Month starting in March, women at that time, in fact, I'm trying to remember when women were allowed to own anything. Back that time, women owned nothing. You didn't have the hairpin in your hair. A married woman could own nothing. And I think it was on into the 1900s and into that a woman could own a business if she was married. When you got married and everything of yours was his. And if you had money, if you had inherited money, so it is also the big theme of, there's always somebody that's the underdog, or the Irish or the Catholics or the, whoever today, transgender people. You just got to pick somebody that that's them, that you go after to justify the things you do, I think. How about, come on, you guys.
Poppy.
Yes.
Okay. I can't get over the whole idea of they had just fought, the Americans our forefathers had just fought for their freedom and then just somehow thought it was fine to have slaves. It just blows my mind. I'm so glad my forefathers weren't here during that time. They were in Belgium.
Economics. It was just pure economics. You just think about it.
The greed, the money talk,
only thing
talks.
you
It has a
couldn't
voice. It has a voice. And but the thing that bothered me so is how many lives were lost over the war, for, yes, states' rights, but also the right to own slaves. How many lives? It's like, those men that perpetrated this allowed all those lives to be slaughtered just because they would not give in. They would not admit their sin and because of their greed. And it just, and then what also bothers me to think too, that here these people were freed. Many of them had no education. They were set up to fail. They had no education. They had no jobs. They had no prospects. Their family was scattered all over. So a lot of them didn't even have a nucleus of family together to rely on. And it's like, then, so what was that? That was just such a mess. It just seems to me such a mess, the way it was all handled. I can't believe thinking men came up with all of this mess. There should have been a much better plan in place to change this. I don't know. I don't know what I would have done, but it just distresses me. But I'm glad it's over. And I really hope we've made progress. I honestly, I worked at Parkland Hospital, which is the county hospital in Dallas, that JFK went to and all this, the big hospital. And I was worked in the ICU, but I worked with, I was a respiratory therapist, and the nurses and all of us, we did not care what color you were. We were all together and trying to help these patients, and we didn't care what color they were. We just, and then I think back, you mean back 100 years, we couldn't have worked together like this? I really feel like we've made some progress, and we keep going, people are people.
I'm going to, Harriet Beecher Stowe two brothers were in the Union Army and in Jacksonville. And Charles, I think, is the one that fought in the Battle of Olustee, but they were in Jacksonville when the war ended. And Harriet's son, one of her sons, Frederick, had a problem with alcohol, then was wounded in the Battle of Gettysburg and was having a hard time. And she thought, well, I'm going to give him a new life. And her brother said, well, come to Jacksonville, come to Northeast Florida. It's really beautiful here. And so she did, and she bought him Laurel Grove Plantation, the land of Laurel Grove Plantation, which is funny because that was Zephaniah Kingsley's plantation, but that she would come and buy his plantation. But anyway, she bought that and brought Frederick down, hoping that he would be able to rehab himself. And as she was this is Orange Park, and came across the river to get mail at this little tiny town of Mandarin, but saw a lot up there and fell in love and bought it and started wintering in Florida. Sadly, her son Frederick just got up and left, never said goodbye, was last seen in San Francisco leaving a hotel, and they never heard of him again. He just disappeared. She never knew what had happened to Frederick. It broke her heart because he was a sweet one. You know, he was her really sweet, loving child. Anyway, but she stayed in Jacksonville, and she started, once again, she's trying to earn money. That still the things are not getting, ends are not meeting. So she starts writing articles again, this way she always had, and they were put together in a book called Meadow Leaves. And so her home, and she had twin daughters. Here they are. And so what happened is one twin would run the home in Jacksonville, and the other twin would run the home in Hartford, Connecticut. Her place is still there, and it's right next to Samuel Clemens's homes, Mark Twain. They're right next to each other. It's worth a trip to see it. Anyway, so she is writing articles, and what she's saying is people started trying to grow cotton again. Well, you can't grow cotton without modern machinery. They didn't even know that there was such a thing, without an intense labor. And she's saying, no, not cotton. No, grow oranges. I mean, this is a place to grow oranges. This is a place to have cattle. This is a place to have vegetables. I mean, you can grow vegetables and send them. The train ended in Jacksonville. There's a train going up and down the East Coast. And she would write these compelling articles about Florida and the cattle. And this, here it is, we're at this time of year, and this is how she describes Florida. She says, for ourselves, we're getting reconciled to a sort of tumble down, wide, picnicky kind of life. This general happy-go-luckiness which Florida inoculates. If we painted her, we should not represent her as a neat, trim damsel with starched linen cuffs and collar. She should be a brunette, dark but comely, with gorgeous tissues, a general disarray and dazzle, and with a sort of jolly untidiness, free, easy, joyful. The great charm, after all, to this life is its outdoorsness. To be able to spend your winter out of doors, even though some days may be cold, to be able to sit with the windows open, to hear the birds daily, to eat fruit from trees, to pick flowers from hedges all winter long. It's about the whole story. If this you can do, and this is why Florida is life and health to the invalid. Well, I mean, people are going, oh, wow. So people started coming to Northeast Florida, and it grew and the whole, you can imagine the whole South is in a deep depression after the Civil War. It was really, really bad, but people started coming to Northeast Florida, and pretty soon they came and they came. And so they would read things like this here. There's a picture. This is a day in Florida in the winter. Dear girls, wouldn't you like to get into a little white yacht and that lies dancing and courtesying on the blue waters of the St. John this pleasant Monday morning? It is a day of days like today. Spring has come with all her smiles and roses in 1 hour. The great blue sheet of water shimmers and glitters like so much liquid lapis lazuli. And now the wood comes in from our neighbor, the owner of the pleasure yacht. Wouldn't you like to go sailing? Oh, yes, indeed we would. That is exactly what we do want to do. And forthwith there's a running and a mustering of the clans and a flapping of the broad palmetto hats. Parties from all three houses file down, present themselves as candidates for pleasure. A great basket of oranges is hoisted in, the white sails spread, and with youth at its prow and pleasure at its helm, away we go, the breezes blowing manfully at our sails. Now, if you were up north and all you saw was, 4 feet of snow, where do you want to be on March 1st or 2nd or whatever today is? And so then she says, there are things you can do here, like cattle. And talking about our friend's experience satisfied us that there's no earthly reason in the climate or surrounding of Florida why milk and honey should be scarce and expensive luxuries as they are now. While one private gentleman could do simply for his own comfort and that of his family, we think might be repeated on a larger scale by somebody in the neighborhood of Jacksonville as a money speculation. Did you know that when, I don't know how it is now, but within the last really decade or so, Florida was the highest cattle producing state in the country over Texas. And then it became second. Thank you, Harriet Beecher Stowe. No one had thought about that. Texas was where cattle was. No, it's Harriet Beecher Stowe. And then she says, and she gives facts, this is how much it costs. This is how much, she says, we don't profess to be land agents. We speak only for the tract of land lying on the St. Johns River between Mandarin and Jacksonville. When we say that there are thousands of acres of good land near to a market, near to a great river on which 3 or 4 steamboats are daily plying, that can be had for $5 an acre, or even less than that. Fine, handsome buildings in the neighborhood of Jacksonville are rising in value, commanding much higher prices than the more productive value of the land. In other words, men pay for advantages for society or facilities afforded by settlements. By the 1880s, 25 train load full of people a day arrived in Jacksonville, Florida. In the 1880s, there were 20 major hotels downtown and countless boarding houses. Major hotels. It was the end of the line. We were the place to stop. We were the Miami. We were the Monte Carlo of the United States. They were the most modern hotels in the country. Were in Jacksonville, Florida. And then there were riverboats going up and down the river, down to the St. Silver Springs, full of people wanting to be part of Florida. I'm sorry, I can't get to all these things, but she would write about that. And people read her and they came. And in fact, and so now today, the Mandarin Museum has erected a statue of Harriet Beecher Stowe. It is so charming. I was kind of worried because I really am into her. You might have noticed that. And I thought, I hope it shows her well. She's an older woman by then. And it's charming. It's just a charming statue. We're going to all go, and I hope everyone here goes to visit that or goes in their own time. Our city was called the Winter City in Summerland. That was the PR for Jacksonville. She said that, there were about 100 boats a day on the going up and down the St. Johns River. The point was that you don't have to have this huge labor people to make a living in Florida. It doesn't have to be, something like sugar. All of the Caribbean, sugar was like growing gold. It was like growing gold. And every inch of land in the Caribbean islands were used for growing sugar, which is very labor intensive, and slavery was just rampant there. And we won the Revolutionary War, many people feel, a great deal because England, they certainly fought for the United States. They didn't like the United States leaving, but if the United States had wanted to take Florida, it had been a different war because Florida was feeding the Caribbean, their Caribbean islands. There was not room on an island to grow a tomato bush because every inch was growing with gold. It was growing gold, which is sugar. You can imagine a world where you never had sugar. The only sweetener you ever had was honey, and suddenly sugar came, and people had to have it, and they were going to have it. And so England, we were a loyalist state, and that was because our vegetables and our food was growing, was feeding the Caribbean islands. Anyway, and the final thing about her is that she, when she would go on a riverboat, she was horrified that people, Northerners, would come and just shoot whatever they saw on the side of the river, birds, alligators, whatever. And so she wrote about the slaughter of wildlife by these so-called hunters. The decks of the boats are crowded with men whose only feeling amid our magnificent forests seemed to be a wild desire to shoot something, and who fire at every living thing on shore, careless of maiming, wounding, or killing their living creatures. The bird trappers come to snare the bright children of the forest. And she asked, who now will speak for the birds? Who will get protection laws passed that will secure us the song and the beauty and the usefulness of these charming fellow citizens of our lovely Florida? And a law was passed stopping the just wanton destruction of they would just go down the river and just shoot everything that moved. So anyway, she impacted our state in an enormous way. And it wasn't until Henry Flagler came and he built his railroad bridge across the St. Johns River, 1889. Old man's folly, everyone called it. It cost him $1 million. He paid for it himself, and he and his train took so many of our tourists down to St. Augustine and eventually down to Miami. So anyway,
I want to say something.
yes, Carol.
Carol has a comment.
Okay. So I think that in reading Uncle Tom's Cabin, I think the reason it was really hard for me to talk about it is because it's so much suffering, and it really bothered me. And I feel like I'm worried about us. I feel like there are times now where we may not have slaves, but we don't treat people any better. And that's very disturbing to me. So in reading that, I really, I have Palmetto Leaves. I have not read it. It was a book my husband had, and I want to read that. And I wanted to know, are the quotes you've done about her in Palmetto Leaves, or is there a biography that you would recommend to us?
Well, I had big stack of books about it. Interestingly, Crusader in Crinland was won the Pulitzer Prize in a long time ago, 1941. It's just a biography of her. But you can buy a lot when you go to the Mandarin store. You can buy Palmetto Leaves, and there are quite a few things about her. And this, I'm just touching the surface of what she did for Florida. Her brothers were here. She got involved in Chloe. Here's a picture. Very involved in politics here. Here is the Mandarin Museum statue of her.
Oh, wow.
So the Mandarin Museum has a lot of information, and so they could give you very good ideas.
I just want to thank you because I don't have the memory that you have for history, and I
don't know. It's getting worse and worse.
wish I did. And I really appreciate it. The other book that I wondered if you read, the one that I have read, is about Flagler, and it's Last Train to Paradise.
Yeah, that's a great book.
I really enjoyed that as well. But I really want to read more about Harriet, and I appreciate you having us read this book and all of your information. And I'm
Well,
sorry.
I backed into her, you know, I never would thought of it. I think that was a surprise that when I read her, I'm going, God, this woman, and I think the quote that I gave to you all that what, I can't remember it. Anyway, and I'll say what she said. I mean, she was a housewife. She was a woman. I mean, she had all the stuff that we have. And she wrote at the end of her life, she said, and there was old fireside stories. She says, I finished all the part of the third book of mine that is to come out this year. This is 1871, to wit, old town fireside stories. And you can have no idea what a perfect luxury of rest it is to be free from all literary engagements of all kinds, sorts of descriptions. I feel like a poor woman I read about once who was always tired because she lived in a house where the help wasn't hired, and whom, when she was laid into her last dying moments, she folded her hands with her latest endeavor, saying nothing, hear nothing, sweet nothing, forever. So that's how she was. And at the end, she had a stroke, and she wrote to Oliver Wendell Holmes, and she said, you know, my physical health has been excellent. My mental condition might be called nomadic.
That's funny.
So anyway, she lost 4 of her 7 children before she died. I mean, the woman knew heartbreak, and the woman knew hard work, and she knew truth. And I just think she's one of these remarkable women that that are popped out sometimes, are remarkable people that you just don't expect to see, and they come and they change the world.
Okay, well, one more comment from Poppy, and then we're gonna have to wrap things up.
You know, thinking of that on page 109, she's this is when I knew she had to be a Christian. You know, I hadn't read her anything about her, started reading the book, and I said, this lady knows Christian principles. It says, there are in this world blessed souls whose sorrows all spring up into joys for others, whose earthly hopes laid in the grave with many tears are the seed from which spring healing flowers and balm for the desolate and the distressed. Among such was the delicate woman who sits there by the lamp, dropping slow tears while she prepares the memorials of her own lost one for the outcast wanderer. You know, she lived that. I mean, she had a grasp that by her faith, you know, she believed that God could redeem any suffering, and she showed that. She turned and made good of things that were very difficult in her own life, and it showed in the book. You know, the same theme, and I was just amazed too. I just loved it. I loved her writing. I loved her humor. I loved all the profound ways that she shared faith in, you know, in her book.
Great. Well, thank you, Susan, and thank you, everyone. This was a wonderful meeting today. Our book next month is This is Happiness by Niall Williams. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. That's our book for April. And then also, just to Susan mentioned, we're going to be our next Art at Noon art walk is going to be a follow-up to this. We're going to be going to Mandarin on Tuesday, March 11th, first to visit Church of Our Savior, which was Harriet Beecher Stowe's church. We'll be meeting there at 10:45. And then we'll have a picnic lunch either by the river or in the fellowship hall at Church of Our Savior, depending on the weather. And it's bring your own lunch. And then we're going to be going to the Mandarin Museum after lunch and visit the new sculpture and also other things at the museum. So all that info is on our website. It is a ticketed event, and we'll need everyone to pay for their ticket to the bookstore by March 6th. So we hope to see you there. The other thing, we've got our March Madness jewelry sale going on this month. So if you need some new jewelry or want to get a jump on your shopping for spring, all of our jewelry is 20% off, March only. All right, thanks, everyone.
I had a
And look forward to
question.
seeing you next time.
Thank you for indulging me, guys.
I had a question, but it's okay.